So wearable tech really takes on many forms, as we've learned in this session so far or throughout the conference. And we've got sensors and gadgets, and we've got augmented reality. And as Tony alluded to, what we're going to discuss for the next hour or so is a profound type of wearable tech. This is really life-changing wearable technology. And it really is something that I find incredible. It was science fiction. Those of us who grew up watching programs like The $6 Million Man some time ago are probably amazed to see that that sort of technology is now coming to life. And the Argus II bionic eye was invented by Dr. Robert Greenberg and his team at Second Sight. And it really allows people to restore sight, but I guess more importantly, it restores their lives. And we're fortunate enough to have his very close associate, Mr. Jim Little, who, as you heard, is the VP of R&D at the company. And he led to the development of the implanted component of the Argus II retinal prosthesis system. He's a 35-year veteran of the medical device industry. He's been named an inventor on 40 issued U.S. patents, as well as numerous international patents and published U.S. patent applications. So, Jim, it's really an amazing pleasure here to have you with us. And I thought before we'd explore the technology, I would take a moment and allow you to just set the stage for us. What sorts of medical problems exactly does your technology solve and specifically remedy?
I suspected you might ask that question. Can everyone hear me? Good. So I brought a slide. This is a cross-section view of the human eye. You can see on the left the lens and cornea, and on the right the optic nerve comes out. The retina is the thin layer of cells that covers almost the entire back of the eye. And it's made of several layers of cells, but the outermost layer is the photoreceptor cells, and they convert light into electrical energy that gets signal processed up through a middle layer of bipolar and horizontal cells to the ganglion cells, which become the optic nerve and send the vision to the brain. There are some diseases where the photoreceptor cells actually die, but some or most of the rest of the cells that are in there are still working and would send a message to the brain if they had some input. So what our system does is to stimulate the ganglion cells that remain electrically and cause them to send a picture. The two diseases that we primarily deal with are macular degeneration, age-related macular degeneration, and that's the top picture. And when your ophthalmologist looks into your eye, the yellow spots are characteristic. He'll see the yellow spots, and that's cellular debris that indicates that the photoreceptor cells are dying. And the bottom one is retinitis pigmentosa. That's a hereditary disease that affects people starting in their 20s typically, and by the time they get past 50, they could have lost some or all of their vision. And that's characterized by the black pigment around the outside, and then you see a bleached area, and the middle of the retina, which is where your acute vision is still pretty good for some people, but eventually it goes completely away. So that's the diseases. They're outer retinal degenerative diseases, primarily retinitis pigmentosa and macular degeneration.
Thank you. So as we finally have, after a 20-year journey, FDA approval, we've got 12 hospitals across the U.S. certified to perform Argus II implant surgery. It was in the 90s, early 90s, that Dr. Greenberg first began to work on the problem, and now it's coming together. I was wondering if you can help us by reflecting back on how it all began. What did the world look like from a technology perspective back then? Obviously quite different. And what were the challenges that you faced in the 90s?
Oh, interesting question. Actually, the story starts a lot earlier than that. As is so often the case in medicine, the technology and the medicine kind of come along in parallel. In 1755, a fellow French physician named Leroy discovered that you could pass electricity through the eye of a blind person and that they would see light. It's sort of an interesting story that reminds you how valuable the Food and Drug Administration is, even though they're a terrible pain in the butt sometimes too. This fellow was blind from cataract, and 1755 electricity was all the rage. Remember, Benjamin Franklin was flying kites in thunderstorms at that point, and people didn't know what could be done with electricity. So he had this blind patient, and he connected a wire around the fellow's head and another wire around his leg, and discharged a bunch of Leyden jars of static electricity through the guy. And the notes were that in addition to the intense pain he felt from the electrical shock, he did see light. It's amazing he survived it.
Yeah, was there a tunnel involved in the light that he saw?
No. Anyway, the next thing that came along this path was in the 1930s, a fellow named Forster discovered that the visual center in the brain is the very back of the brain, and he figured out that if you put an electrode against the brain in the back, that you could cause the patient to see a spot of light. And then in the 1960s, another fellow named Brindley figured out that he actually mapped the visual cortex in the brain, showed that a particular physical location on the brain was connected to the perception of light in a particular spot. And yes, as you can imagine, in order to do this experiment, he had someone who was awake with their scalp and the back of their skull cut away so he could poke away at their brains. In the 1970s, a fellow named Dobell from New York actually made the first visual implant, and it was an array of electrodes stuck into the visual cortex with a connector on the patient's skull so that he could close the skull back up. And you can imagine what portable electronics looked like in the 70s, but he had a cable coming out of the patient's head to a computer system, and he could send signals to it and cause vision. Some of Brindley's patients died as a result of his experiments, and Dobell's experiments caused seizures in several patients. Messing about in someone's brain is serious business and not to be taken lightly. In about 1990, Eugene Dewan and Mark Humayun at Duke University filed a patent application for stimulating the retina to provide visual assistance. And during the 90s at Johns Hopkins and Harvard and several other universities, a lot of really important research was done to show that you could stimulate the retina electrically on blind people and that they could perceive something. In 1998, Dr. Dewan and Humayun and Robert Greenberg, who's president of our company, filed a patent application on the prototype of what our visual prosthesis would be, which is an externally worn camera with signal processing and a radio link to an implanted neurostimulator in the eye. That's the same year our company was formed by a couple of investors who've done a lot of medical device investing, and they hired Dr. Greenberg to run the company. And he proceeded to identify from his graduate work at Johns Hopkins, he knew what the technical challenges were, and he hired the very best people he could find from around the world to solve those technical challenges. And the technology that was available in the 60s and 70s and 80s would not have supported this kind of activity. But by the late 90s, early 2000s, computer chip technology was pretty mature, and the size and weight of computer processing power and video cameras had shrunk, and MEMS was becoming fairly well developed. MEMS is using semiconductor processing techniques to make mechanical structures. So the technology was finally ready by the late 90s to actually try to do a project like what we've done.
Excellent. In the mid-2000s, the first real surgical trials began. And I'm curious, what sorts of breakthroughs had to happen for this to take place? And was it a matter of developing the right sensor implant and video translation technology? Or were there actual surgery-related breakthroughs that had to occur in parallel in order to be able to perform successful operations?
Well, I would say all of those things. The sensor and video processing part was important, but I wouldn't characterize that really as a breakthrough so much as just good engineering. There were some technical challenges to doing the device that were significant. One is packaging a 60-channel neurostimulator with a two-way radio in an electronics package the size of an aspirin that is hermetically sealed, that could run in the ocean for years. The electrode array technology had to be developed, and that was significant. Actually, we had to come up with an implantable physical design for the device that would fit on the eye and that surgeons could implant. We were lucky enough to work with a really first-class surgical team at the University of Southern California to do this development and to do enough preclinical testing. We could convince the Food and Drug Administration that it was safe to implant and we could put it into people. They were good enough to come up with a surgical procedure that consists mainly of techniques that vitreoretinal surgeons use all the time to repair detached retinas and various other standard processes. So it's not a particularly challenging surgical procedure. But all of that was required to be able to start implanting.
So,
there was one
Sure.
other thing that's kind of important. Nobody knew at that time whether you could chronically stimulate the cells in the retina without killing them. There was some speculation that electrical stimulation might damage the cells. So we developed a first-generation device that was basically a modified cochlear implant and implanted it in 6 people in California between 2002 and 2004 that showed that the effect of the stimulation did not wear off and that the cells continued to be viable. That was pretty significant work that we had to do in order to prepare for what we've done now.
that brings us to today, and I'm wondering, what does the current Argus 2 tech consist of? Can you explain for us, as well as the implanted sensor, how does it communicate with the brain itself?
I have an animation, but now I have to figure out how to start it.
In Second Sight's Argus 2 retinal prosthesis system, a miniature video camera in the eyeglasses captures the scene. The video is processed by a small portable unit and transformed into instructions which are sent back to the glasses. These instructions are then transmitted wirelessly to the implant on the eye. The implant consists of a receiver and an array of electrodes. Instructions are received and corresponding signals sent to the array, which emit small pulses of electricity. These pulses stimulate the retina's remaining cells and are transmitted down the optic nerve, conveying visual information to the brain, which perceives patterns of light. Patients learn to interpret these visual patterns.
So the components of the system are the implant, which you can see a photograph on the left side, consists of a little aspirin tablet-sized radio. The gold coil is the antenna that communicates to the external system. And you can see a little electrode array coming off to the right. And the device is implanted as shown in the right illustration. The radio and coil is on the outside of the eye under the conjunctiva, so you can't see it from outside. And the electrode array cable passes through the eye wall, and the electrode array is actually attached to the back of the retina. And then in addition to that, we have an external signal processor and glasses and camera and the radio transmitter to send the power and data into the implant. In the medical device business, it's all about what you can prove in a clinical trial. This is a description of, we're not well situated for this, are we?
I'd say no.
The clinical study showed that the patients that we implanted this in were completely blind. And when I say completely blind, ophthalmologists quit judging visual performance somewhere around hand motion or count fingers. So if they can wave their hand back and forth in front of a patient and the patient can see movement, that's hand movement. This is two fingers. If they can identify that, that's count fingers. And if they can't do those things, what's worse than that is light perception with projection, which means you can see a light and tell where it's coming from. Light perception with no projection means if you flashed a flash bulb in front of them, they would know that you had flashed it, but they wouldn't be able to tell where. And then no light perception is nothing at all. We implanted patients who were no light perception or bare light perception, and 100% of them were able to see visual percepts. All but one of them could localize a square on a computer monitor and touch it. More than half could trace the direction of a moving line across a computer screen, and about a quarter of them you could measure visual acuity using something like an ETRS chart. In terms of what they could do with it, somewhere between 50 and 80% of them could follow a line that was on the floor. Half of them could find a door in the wall, and somewhere between half and 75% of them could read letters and characters. I've got some video later in case we get to that. There's certainly big letters are easier to see, but they're bigger than the visual field, and the patient has to scan around to see them and remember all of that. So sort of the ideal letter size is about 20-degree field of view. Bigger than that, people can pretty much get, and smaller than that, some can, down to a certain point where they run out of resolution. Did that answer?
Yes, so you said the letters would be like 2 feet high.
Well, when you say how big it is, the other half of that is how far away. So we talk about it in terms of visual angle, and something around 20 degrees is sort of the best resolution. And that would be maybe a foot high at arm's length.
So the patients that you helped, they must have had a history of vision prior to losing it?
Yes, yes.
The formulation of D1 and D2 have problematic light. It would get in with folks that didn't have history.
Right, that's absolutely right. These two diseases both affect people later in life, and so their visual pathways are fully developed by then, and they all learn to read, so when you show them letters, even though it's been 20 years, they can still remember what the letters look like. Yeah. I didn't expect we were going to get... Yeah. Thanks for coming.
So in terms of recovery time, what are we looking at, and how soon do you know if the operation was a success or not?
In the early days in the clinical trial, we turned it on the day after the surgery. We had a couple of cases of infection in the eye and determined that from now on we will only turn it on a week or more after the surgery to allow the surgical incisions to heal. But usually the first time you turn it on, you have a pretty good idea of what the combination of the device and the retina is going to look like. There's a lot of things that can affect what the patient's going to get from the device. It's a degenerative disease that we're treating, and the degeneration is not always uniform, so there's a possibility that you could have a spot on the retina where there were no viable cells. In that case, your stimulation wouldn't do anything. What you're finally going to get for performance could take 6 months or a year, and it depends on how hard the patient's willing to work at it and how effective that the rehab is.
So now that the patient's physically recovered, the technology is operational, please walk us through the possibilities for the patient. If all goes well, what can the patient who was prior to surgery literally blind now see and do?
I have some videos of patients doing some things. If you guys get bored with this, tell me and I'll stop showing them, but this is my life, so I love to talk about it. This is kind of silly, and I apologize for the resolution, but it's one of my favorite videos. We didn't know this was being done. BBC interviewed one of our patients and did this video, and when we saw it, we were amazed. And go ahead and hit that if you would, thanks.
No one expects Grandma to play like a professional, but for Linda Morford, that any ball goes in is amazing. She's totally blind. The small circle in her glasses is a camera, and some clever electronics turns the images into patterns of dark and light. It may not sound like much, but for Linda, it's made a huge difference.
So it's kind of a parlor trick thing. We asked her how she did it, and she said, well, she could scan around and see light on the sides, and she could see the backboard is dark, and so she shot the basketball towards the middle of the black spot. So it isn't that she was seeing in the sort of detail that you or I see, but you can see that there was some functional benefit to it. This one's a little more interesting. This is one of our French subjects. I hope you understand French.
Le 9, je pense.
Oui, 9.
D'accord.
So that's a letter size and a distance that you can get reference.
Ça, c'est le 5, je pense.
Oui, 5.
Voilà. Ça, c'est le... Où il aurait été conscriptant. Voilà, ça, c'est le 3.
Oui, 3. Correct.
I don't remember what this one is. If you would start it, that'd be good. It's black and white.
Maintenant, combien de
Oh.
poteaux vous pouvez voir l'un après l'autre?
This is a mobility shot. He's counting posts in the street.
3, 4.
Okay, sounds clear. Okay.
One of the really important things for a blind person to be able to be mobile is to cross streets. And following the crosswalk lines and identifying the curb at the other side are kind of interesting. Excuse me. This was the first day this guy tried this outside. He spotted the curb. Didn't quite believe it. And then stepped up onto it.
Alors là, oui. Je sais pas si c'est encore réalité là-bas.
This fellow is just following one of the clinicians as she walks
Passe
around.
par là. Ça fait une blanche. Alors là.
How are we doing on time? Now, you talked about letter size. This was an early reading letters thing. After this first shot, you'll see in the lower right is a computer monitor. That's our clinical fitting tool, and there's two displays on it. One is what the camera is seeing. It's on the left side of the display, and on the right side is what the electrodes are being instructed to do. So you'll be able to see not only the letters, but what information the patient is getting. And for really big letters, you can see they really aren't getting much of it. They have to scan around and remember what they've seen, but they can do that. Go ahead, thank you. She's tracing.
Say an R.
Yes.
S.
Yes.
Has this gone smaller?
Yes.
Ah. Also, is it an O?
Yes.
A V.
Yes.
Now, at that point, it was the same size as the visual field. This one's smaller,
K.
but she still got it.
C.
Yes.
An O.
Yes.
What is the approximate pixel resolution, and what is your projection across like 20 years as to how that will increase?
We're going to get to that a little bit. This one is 60 pixels. It's a 6 by 10 array in a visual field. It's about 20 degrees in one direction, about 12 in the other direction. So it's still very crude. This is an activities, a daily living thing.
C'est ça, hein. North.
This one up here,
Uh-huh.
is that the circle?
Why don't you put your hand up there and confirm that? Good. Put your hand up there. Touch it now. Remember our
It's like I'm trying to touch it, it's going to bite.
remember our hand coordination practice. Now, good. Take it.
I'm getting that pulsing of light. Look away.
That's enough of that one.
That was a real buzz.
Oh, you asked about
boost,
color
'cause I love
vision.
doing
We've
the
done some
colours.
work with color,
I
and
mean,
this
when
is an
I first
example.
saw the blue, they sort of push the button, and you hear the click, and it's like, wow, I said, that was blue, and that actually brought a little tear to my eye because I haven't seen blue for so long, and it was such a beautiful blue, Some of the colours, like the yellow and the orange, where they sort of, they're messing about with it, aren't they? The colours are not so...
Well, not so vibrant.
No.
They tend to
Yeah.
blend into each other a bit.
Yeah, they do, but the blue and the green, I always go on about, and I say to Joe, oh, give me a blue.
Sorry, the audio is so weak on those. Oh, thanks.
So we have seen some amazing examples of people getting back to a normal life, and I just can't imagine something more traumatic than losing your sight. I'm curious, beyond the videos, what sorts of things have you seen in terms of people's lives getting back to more normal? What sorts of things can you describe to us?
As part of our clinical study, we commissioned a independent review of the effect on people's lives that was conducted by licensed rehab therapy people. And remember, this is really crude vision. This is not vision like you or I have. It's very low resolution, crude vision. So they're not using it to identify faces or read the newspaper or things like that. But they did talk about being able to cross streets and to find windows and doors and to avoid running into obstacles. And interestingly enough, one of the things that many of the people valued was when they're speaking with someone, they can look at them and know that they're still there. They said that there's nothing worse than talking to someone and realizing that the person has turned to walk away and they didn't even know. So people talk about feeling more connected, seeing movement. Grandmas go into their grandkids' soccer games and they can't see the details, but they can see the movement and they enjoy seeing the movement. It's still early days and this is a beginning, but it's providing some visual input for these people.
Now, in the medical device world, you mentioned, I think it was FDA, one of the governmental bodies that regulates, and you didn't say this, these are my words, it potentially slows down innovation, also charged with keeping us safe. But the medical device world, 20 years is really a short period of time compared to the tech world, where those of us in the audience that many of us are in the industry know that in Moore's Law and what we've just seen with technology, smartphones and tablets and very small devices beyond that, 18 months is a very long time, it seems, or 24 months. So the temptation is to ask you what we'll see in the next year or two, but the reality is, what will we see in the next 5 years, I guess, as these two markets tend to blend, where we have Moore's Law coming more and more into the medical device space. What sorts of things will we see? We talked about color with the audience. We had that question. We had a question on resolution. You know, what's your feeling on 5 years out?
I think better resolution is certainly one thing that we need to work on, and we think with software we can do some improvement to that. Color vision is an interesting thing. Color vision is built into our retinas. There's red, green, and blue photoreceptor cells, and the rest of the tissue in there knows what to do with that to give the perception of color. So part of what we have to do is to figure out how to access that. And that's made harder by the fact that retinal ganglion cells are about 10 microns in diameter, and our electrodes are about 200 microns in diameter. So when we stimulate, we're stimulating big groups of cells that perhaps have different functions. I think there's probably 16 different kinds of ganglion cells, and each one of them has a different function. And so ultimately, to get really down to good resolution color vision, we probably need to make electrodes a lot more similarly sized to the cells so that we can target specifically what's going on. And the software part of being able to talk to the retina will be really important. I think in the next 5 years, the size and weight of the external system will get dramatically smaller. The glasses should become less obnoxious looking and more comfortable to wear, and the video processing, perhaps we can even build it into the glasses. So there's a lot of room to improve the system.
Earlier today, we saw Jennifer Darmore's presentation, and one of the interesting things was the keyboard built into the pants. And I found that fascinating just because it shows an example of, you know, a thoughtful new interface that probably is not really going to work, but it's something new. And so it seems like we will continue to dabble with a bunch of different sorts of interfaces until we get the right one. But I think everyone in this room wishes that there was a direct connection to the brain that they could tap into so that we could think, and then the wearable technology would do what we wanted to do immediately. It would make life a lot easier. And the question is, since you're already, to some degree, getting involved with surgery in the brain, and at least interacting with the brain in a more direct fashion, will we eventually be able to bypass the optic nerve and somehow connect directly to the brain?
I think that's an interesting question. I think we'll have to. Using the retinal access means that the optic nerve has to be good, which rules out people with glaucoma and lots of other diseases, and for military people, blast injuries, and for all sorts of causes of blindness other than outer retinal degenerations. We'll have to go to the brain. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been some work done to show that that you can create visual perception from the brain. I think our next step will be to move in that direction and see what we can do in terms of being able to provide vision to a much broader audience. People with all sorts of other visual impairments besides retinal degenerations.
And that actually leads me to the next question as we're slowly getting ready to wrap here. Your technology with Argus 2 allows you to restore vision, and the question that some of us may be thinking about is, what about someone who's born without vision? Is there some way of restoring that over time? What are the challenges there, and when do you think they may be overcome?
That's a really good question. We had a comment from over here about development of the visual pathway. We aren't born being able to see. We're like an unformatted hard drive when we're born. If you've watched an infant, you can see until several months of age they can't really even focus their eyes, or at least we're not aware that they're focusing them. Really interesting study that Ione Fine published a few years ago about a fellow who was blinded at age 3 by an acid splash, and his vision was restored at about age 30 by a corneal transplant. And he was, by all objective measures, his vision was completely restored, and yet if you talk to him, he doesn't perceive depth. There's a lot about vision, the way we perceive it, that he still doesn't have. And the assumption is that when you're a little kid, your brain is really plastic and can learn how to process this information and use it. If you try to do that at age 30, your brain is already committed resources to other activities, and it may not learn. So it'll be interesting to see whether we're able to do something for people who are born blind. The cochlear implant example is interesting in that they're implanting really young children with cochlear implants now, and children who are implanted young do much, much better than people who receive the device as adults. So there's a lot of work to be done, and some of it's technology, a lot of it's medicine and neuroscience.
Now, we had some questions earlier. I'm going to open things up to questions, and I've got a few of my own, but first I wanted to make sure there was enough time for audience participation. All right, so yes.
So for the patients who are seeing colors in the video, were they seeing colors or were they trained to recognize the intensity of what they're seeing?
So let me repeat the question. For the persons that were seeing color in the video, were they actually seeing color, or were they trained to see the colors?
The video that you saw was the first day of that experiment. I don't believe that person was trained. What was required to do that, though, was a very ad hoc experiment where we changed the stimulation parameters, and a certain combination of stimulation parameters would produce a percept of a color. And so I think it was more for each patient for us to figure out what we had to do to the stimulation to cause the color than it was them learning to identify it. Does that answer your question? Do you want to try to repeat? I think you said, did we intend to incorporate machine learning to try to optimize for an individual patient? Is that what you said? I think we would like very much to do that. We're a startup company that 14 years in is still spending investor capital, and we've had to be very tightly constrained in how we've spent the money to try to get the problem solved. Now that we've got the product on the market, if we can start generating some capital, that's exactly the sort of thing we would like to do. And also, I hope that there'll be researchers who are interested in this who could apply their brain power to working with these patients as well.
Yes, in the back, sir.
Hi, my name is Sean Montgomery. I run an engineering shop here in the city, but my PhD was in neuroscience with a guy named Yuri Bujaki. And I was curious, sort of transitioning myself from neuroscience into engineering, what your thoughts are on one really brilliant work I did. As we move into brain interface devices, I can imagine the engineering is going to experience the same exponential curve we've experienced in other parts of electronics. And I'm wondering, what's the V2 phenomenon going to be? What are principles going forward that will allow us to adapt to not have to replace, going and doing surgeries in our brains and be replacing these electronics every other year? Or, what are principles going forward that will allow us to keep pace with technology as it's progressing and not punish our developers in this space?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'm an engineer and not a neuroscientist, so I kind of have a narrower view, I guess. But one of the things that we did in our product is to make the implant very stupid and put all of the computation in an external processor where we can change it, and we do. During the clinical trial, we put out a new software release about twice a year. And at this point, we're still doing once or twice a year software upgrades. There's all sorts of things that we've been able to do in the computational algorithm area, edge detection and face recognition and all sorts of things that we can build in because our computational power is not implanted. Ultimately, we'll get to the end of what we can do with 60 electrodes, but I completely agree with the spirit of what you're saying, that you can't have, it's not appropriate to go in and do surgery every time you come up with a new trick.
Also, that gets me to battery technology. How does that work?
Our battery is external. Basically, we've got a camcorder battery on the external processor, and we transmit power into the implant along with the data. And that's because we didn't want to have to deal with the issues of implanted batteries. Things actually pretty thirsty, and it would take a lot of battery power.
Now, sir, I don't want to embarrass you at all, but I love your shirt. You want to stand up one more time so everyone can see that? I mean, that's just an example of wearable technology. People ask, will wearable technology go mainstream? I'm not quite sure that will, but it's very, very cool and novel. And I want to learn more about it after the session is done. So, unless you want to tell us now.
So this is actually measuring my heartbeat from like a polar strap. We'll talk about it more individually, but this is measuring my gut and skin response. How excited I am.
So we can tell if you're lying, right?
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, we've got a question over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious if you did any investigation into alternate sensor technologies, so ultrasonic, sonar, IR, or try to augment what you were doing? To replicate the visual with something other than optical or visual?
We've started to look at some of that. Did everybody hear the question? Have we looked at other sensors other than cameras for enhancing vision? We have started to look at some things in that, other than video cameras. A little too early to talk about, but there's a lot of possibility there.
Yes, sir.
What is the total number of people on the planet with optical implants?
We've implanted between 50 and 60. There's a competitor in Germany who's implanted 30, and 29 of them have failed. And there's another competitor in Germany that's implanted 12, and all of theirs have failed. We've had 2 failed.
What's the addressable market? We have a lot of investors here, so I thought it might be worth.
It's enormous, huge market. There's probably 200,000 people in the United States that have retinitis pigmentosa, significant vision loss. Not all of them are completely blind. Actually, the number of them that are completely blind is quite a bit smaller. Age-related macular degeneration in the United States, there are about 2 million people. Similarly, not all of them are blind, but there's a progression. So significant numbers of patients, particularly in a market without competitors.
So the next 2 questions an investor's thinking of, and I'll just say it out loud for them, is insurance picking this up? If they are, or even if they aren't, what sort of costs are we talking about, if you're comfortable letting us know?
I think the price of the device in the United States is about $145,000, and the key to being reimbursed for it is, we thought would be to get Medicare approval. We've made application with CMS for Medicare approval for it, and early indications are very positive. We should know about inpatient payment this week, and probably by October we'll know about outpatient. We were very happy to learn last week that one of the major private insurers has made a positive national coverage decision on the device in advance of Medicare, which stuns me. We're trying not to get too excited about that because there's probably 200 more private insurers that we need to work with too, but the cost of taking care of blind people is really high. And so a one-time cost even of $145,000, if it can reduce downstream cost of taking care of someone or their loss of productivity or all of the other things that are associated with blindness, the healthcare policy people consider that to be a good deal. So it's an expensive product, and there's a good-sized market for it, and we're hopeful that we can actually make back some of the investors' money.
No other questions? Okay, so oh, yes.
Sorry, just one quick one. Obviously, your resolution right now is pretty small.
Yes.
The hardware, the technical hardware of a much higher resolution clearly is out there.
Yep.
What's holding you
Okay, so the question is, the resolution is relatively low for the technology at the moment. Of course, when you compare it to maybe a monitor or something like that, a computer monitor or HDTV, and what's keeping you from getting to the next level or making a quantum leap?
Money. It's at each step of increased resolution, there's a list of technical problems to overcome, and there's also some don't know if I should call them medical issues, but you know, for example, the smaller the electrodes get, the closer they have to be to the target tissue to actually stimulate them. So we need to learn not only how to make more smaller electrodes, but we need to learn how to implant them closer to the target tissue. I believe that if we're successful and can make a viable market in this device, that we'll use the money that we can take in from that product to move to the next level, like computer monitors 25 years ago were monochrome and were 640 by 480, and now they're all the colors you can imagine and pixels so tiny you can't even see them. And that's happened over time because there was a market for it. And I don't see any unsolvable problems in improving the resolution. It's just that it's going to take time and money.
Any other questions? Okay, so yes. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get you a microphone. If that's okay. Let's see if one of these is working. Let me take that one out. Let's give us one moment, please.
Hi, so I'm Chung Hae, and my boss, Michael Mersnick, has done a lot of work with cochlear implants, and he finds that across a lot of different setups of the device and algorithms, you still get very great outcomes, which is awesome. And so I was wondering, do you guys look at training or harnessing the power of brain plasticity to make your patients have better perception or acuity compared to other products?
That's an interesting thing to consider. One of the things about cochlear implants that's interesting, the first cochlear implants had one electrode, and so they basically squawked like Donald Duck. And the chairman of our board was the founder of Advanced Bionics, which is the only United States-based cochlear implant company. And he laughed about the original ones being aids to lip reading. You really couldn't hear much with them. I think the Cochlear Corp device from Australia has 22 electrodes, and the Advanced Bionics device has 16 electrodes. And typically when they fit the patients with them, they don't use all of the electrodes. They use maybe 6 or 8 of them. And most of the advances in cochlear implant performance in the last 10 or 15 years have been in signal processing and stimulation strategies. And at this point, I believe that people are able to distinguish adjacent notes on a piano keyboard even though they're only using 8 or so electrodes, which makes us suspect that there's plenty of room for us to improve resolution using software as well. During the clinical trial, we didn't do any rehabilitation training with the patients because we didn't know to. With our commercial patients, we're doing a lot of rehab and trying to teach the people how to use the device more effectively, and it appears to be helping. One of the curious things that several of our clinical trial patients have said is that for 6 months or a year, they see spots of light, and then one day they see images. And I believe that is exactly brain plasticity. that it's like learning a language. For a while, you hear a word in Spanish and you convert it to an English word. Every word has to be converted, and then one day you realize you're just hearing it in Spanish, and I think it's a very similar thing. There's a lot we don't know about how the brain processes that kind of information, and I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. Does that respond to your question?
A little bit. I mean, I guess some things that he's found is that if you train somebody who has a cochlear implant to listen to the word and hear themselves say that exact word, that remapping
Yes.
helps their brain translate what other people say and that signal corresponding to what words are really being said. And
That's
that actually promotes brain plasticity and brain training. So you can
Yeah.
train the user to be faster at learning how to use devices.
Yeah.
I mean, I work at a brain training company at Posit Science, and so I'm just really curious to know about the other sides of clinical applications, like what you guys are doing.
I think you guys should pitch in with us.
That would be great.
That's really fascinating. You know, one of the things that you saw in one of the videos was a patient using a cutout block, various shapes of blocks, and trying to fit them together. And we figured out that we don't really know what the people see. You know, I mean, they see spots of light and they learn how to interpret it. But by learning that this feels like a circle and it looks like this, so this means circle, the kind of thing you're talking about audibly might work very well visually, and would be really delighted to make some progress on that area. I feel like what we've done is to make a technology that starts us being able to work with the brain now. We've made it possible to pursue this sort of work. But I'm fascinated with that. Let me talk to you later and get some contact info.
Yeah,
So-
that'd be great. Thank you.
With that, if you could please join me in thanking Jim for a fantastic job.
Thank you.